live.
Nice.
Let me get some links
We're doing it live.
thrown out.
Nice. Just got a YouTube notification.
Good. And then Rumble is giving me a 404 error. God's sake, Rumble. I want Rumble to work. People actually use it.
Yeah. They're doing good. Let's see where their stocks hit. Rumble. Okay, not doing Yahoo Finance then, I guess.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Got it. All right, let me send a message out here.
Yeah, good one.
X. Beautiful. Oh, Jesus is not feeling well at the moment. He wishes us a good stream. Thank you, Jesus.
I hope you feel better.
Yeah.
Everyone's been under the weather.
Yeah, I did my time in February. I'm done. I never want to. I never want to go through what I went through in February again, man. Oh boy.
I had it last week.
You had it last week?
Yeah, but it was mild. It was lingering. It's just kind of annoying. It's like,
yeah,
doesn't really get out. It's just mild and lingers.
Did you see that Steve Kirsch put out that nebulizer thing for respiratory illnesses, going like, I think I figured out how to cure all respiratory. Yeah, it's on the Substack. You might want to check it out. I think I'm gonna buy. It's like $50 worth of stuff that theoretically, like, you can tackle any respiratory illness forever, ever again.
Okay. Sounds interesting.
Yes. Okay. So, let's stop enjoying this music here, which is hard for me because I really like that guy. We'll switch over to this for the moment, the dynamic scene, and let me get our subject in question on the chopping block. Nima, are you ready to do some chopping?
Yeah. Reluctantly.
Okay. So we're here. We're live. This is Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irida TV, and we've got the topic that you've all been waiting for to discuss today, which is fractional reserve banking. And yes, you probably have heard of this before, and if you're new to the show, you probably think you already know what you're going to hear, but let me assure you,
you are right.
No. If they haven't seen the show, if they have seen the show before, they know what they're going to hear. But if they
Yeah.
haven't seen the show before, and you think we're going to talk about, oh, here's the creature from Jekyll Island, and how the private bankers own the Federal Reserve, and they're sucking, blah, 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 you're not going to hear that here. So hopefully we can make you angry and give supporting evidence why the I guess we could even call it the traditional viewpoint from the I don't have better words for this. I'm sorry. From the conspiracy side of things, is actually inaccurate, and we hope to give you some accurate information, both because it's helpful for you investing your own money, and second, if you're going to solve a problem, you might want to actually know what the accurate state of the situation is. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at. I'll pull it up right now. Let's go over here, and we're going to share this tab instead. The biggest scam in the history of mankind, hidden secrets of money. This is from Mike Maloney. That was his name. Did I get it right, Nima?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike Maloney. He's obviously on the Austrian side of the economic spectrum, and we're just gonna take a look at this video, have a little dissection, and see if it stands to the evidence of reality. Nima has taken the time to look through it already. I'm going to respond to it for the first time, so hopefully we have a fun dynamic there. But Nima, before I click the play button, is there any preemptive information that you want to give?
I think the first 3 minutes are very dramatic preparation for how insanely, amazingly shocking the forthcoming information is going to be, with dramatic music behind it and zero informational value.
Okay,
So
so we can skip all that.
I think so. There's a certain portion that you can certainly skip. Yeah.
Well, I'll start here at this first little bump
Yeah.
and see if that skips the intro. And let's see, I'll turn the volume up a little bit.
I mean, for entertainment purposes, I guess it's kind of funny. But let's just watch the beginning and observe how there's nothing being said in the very beginning for like several minutes.
Okay, let's do it.
You are about to learn one of the biggest secrets in the history of the world.
Whoa!
It's a secret that has huge effects for everyone who lives on this planet. Most people can feel deep down that something isn't quite right with the world economy, but few know what it is. Gone are the days where a family can survive on just one paycheck. Every day it seems things are more and more out of control, yet only 1 in a million understand why. You are about to discover the system that is ultimately responsible for most of the inequality in our world today. The powers that be do not want you to know about this, as this system is what has kept them at the top of the financial food chain for the last 100 years. Learning this will change your life because it'll change the choices that you make.
Let's see if it
If
does
enough
that.
people learn it, it'll change the world
Big statement.
because it'll change the system. For this is the biggest hidden secret of money. Never in human history have so many been plundered by so few, and it's all accomplished through this, the biggest scam in the history of mankind.
I just got to give a quick comment on that. We've looked at the history of money all the way back to ancient Sumeria, and I got to say, as bad as the situation may be right now, I don't know if I would want to live under the financial conditions of ancient Sumeria. Nima, would you say that's an accurate?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be a peasant who's forced to go bankrupt every couple of years because there's no rain or because seasonality wasn't
And
conducive.
bankruptcy means being sold into slavery.
Yeah, or quartered, I guess.
Yeah.
Worst case. Also, I want to point out that so this guy claims that watching this video will change the system. So let's watch this video and find where or how he thinks that people watching this video are going to change the system. Because I couldn't detect that aspect of this video. But okay.
Let's go. In 7 easy steps. I like that.
I didn't even
They
know
say that
that.
money doesn't grow.
You missed that on the first time through.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the money tree.
On trees. But the truth is that the modern banking system creates currency far faster than trees can grow. Most people don't have a clue how currency is created. Economists and bankers make it sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. But I'm going to strip our monetary system down to its essence so that you can see the scam behind the curtain.
I wanted to stop there and agree with him on that point, that there is this whole, I guess, academic world designed to obfuscate how stuff actually works. So I would agree with him on that.
And he's part of that, ironically. So
Yes.
there's that.
And just how it affects you. Every modern society creates currency in pretty much the same way. But since the US dollar is the majority of the world's currency, I'm going to use the United States as our example. It all starts when some politician says, "Vote for me and I'll make sure the government provides you more free stuff than my opponent will." But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So to provide that supposedly free stuff, the politicians vote for the country to spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you
First error.
Yeah.
This is entirely not how it works at all.
Right. The government doesn't borrow money and then spend it. They spend it first, and the amount they spend over the amount they remove via taxation is the deficit. And then after the fact, they sell bonds to allow people who accumulated those net private savings to earn interest on their money, which is a choice by the government. As we've pointed out many times, they wouldn't have to do that. They do it because I guess, there's a lot of banking lobby. There's a lot of rich people who want to earn income on their money at zero risk. So I guess that could be cited as a justification or whatever. But
And then
he has a process backwards already, right then and there. Yeah.
Right. And then
Because
just to
doesn't
prove
explain
our point,
where does the money actually come from, right? So his cycle begins with the government borrowing money that is there somehow. But where does it come from? Well, it starts with a deficit spending government creating money out of nowhere and declaring a tax so that people need that money and then spending it into existence, taxing some of it out of existence.
Yeah, and then I mean, it's what he's saying. Nima pointed this out, but I want to kind of put it in like a logical order. Is it's not what this guy's saying, Mike Maloney. It's actually not logically possible because Nima just pointed this out. If the government is going to borrow these U.S. dollars, where did those U.S. dollars come from to begin with? In order to borrow the dollars, they had to be created in the first place, and because there's only one place that those dollars can get created, which is the U.S. government, the spending actually has to happen before the taxation can happen.
And before the bond sales can happen.
Right, because if the spending didn't happen, there'd be no money to buy the bonds with, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's right off the
way,
bat.
This has recent, once again, practical implications that are helpful to understand. When the government runs into the debt ceiling, they are still able to spend money magically, right? How is that? Well, because all that happens is that their bond sales operations stop, but they can still spend money into existence. They can still pass their bills. All that happens is that that money does not get sucked back out of the system and put into bonds where it pays interest, which causes some other problems in the banking sector that we don't have to go into right now.
There's liquidity issues. I mean, there is some complexities here, but
yeah, there's issues with the banks' supplemental leverage ratio, where the their reserves are counted as a risky investment, and that creates some problems. And when those reserves get sucked out of the system, when people buy newly issued bonds, that helps banks actually free up their balance sheet and make more loans and also buy some more stocks in their stock portfolio, where they buy on their own account, and their bond portfolio certainly.
So you heard it from Nima. When the reserves go down, the loans can go up.
Mm-hmm. Which is contrary to the fractional thesis.
Say it again.
Which is, by the way, contrary to the fractional reserve thesis.
Exactly. That's why I pointed that out. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, loan me $1 trillion today,
Why is it
and
a
I promise
glorified
over a
IOU?
10-year period I'm going to...
Why is it what?
Why is it a glorified IOU? Why isn't it just an IOU? Like, where's the glorification come from? I was, doesn't matter. That's really a thought that came into my mind. When I was
I
watching
think
this.
it's a perfect example of the intro. There's a lot of emotionally loaded language here
Yeah,
that isn't
sure.
that if we look at it and go, what does that mean? There's nothing behind nothing there.
Right.
pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest. But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation.
But they're not.
No, yeah. So the government frequently rolls over several hundreds of trillions of dollars of bonds every year, actually, because people always say, oh my god, how are we all going to pay back this $35 trillion debt or what we have or whatever? Well, guess what we actually just did, and we did
Last
year,
quarter or whatever.
and we did the year prior. I think there was recently a year, it may have been 2020, 2021, wherever, where the government repaid something like $170 trillion in debt. Because
in
obviously,
quotes debt. I want to
that's
emphasize that because it's
issue,
not
yeah.
the same debt as you or I paying on like if we issued a corporate and I read a TV corporate bond, it's not the same
Right.
thing.
Right,
Yeah.
like we said earlier, the federal government spends money into existence, taxes some out of the existence. The reserves are left over in the private sector. The federal government offers bonds against those reserves, and if people want to, they can buy the bonds that pay them interest. And so it's a choice that the federal government makes to offer these bonds. It's not that they need your money or anything like that. It's not a debt in that sense.
I'm gonna keep going.
Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice
It's
that
you
as
and
we
me, by
move
the
through
way.
this process,
Right. I just bought a bunch of bonds.
Yeah, so this
Neiman's
is
helping me set up a permanent portfolio, and he's like, "Yeah, part of it is buy some bonds. I just bought a bunch of bonds."
yeah. So this is the private sector. There, the people with the paddle there. This is all of us. These are available to all of us. They're not just available to some cabal or some secret elite. This is available to every one of us to buy every week, pretty much on the open market, or every quarter in the case of 30-year treasuries or whatever. And by the way, they're saying they're stealing money. Actually, they're giving the private sector an interest-bearing asset that pays
With no
us
risk.
it pays us even more money at no risk. So technically, it's actually the opposite. They're giving the private sector an asset that generates more income for the private sector out of nothing. So not necessarily stealing. And also, when I'm buying these bonds, nobody showed up and put a gun to my head and forced me to buy them, right? So it's not really theft in that sense.
Well, and then I think that this is important to point out right at the beginning is it's a lot easier when you stop thinking about it in terms of bonds and money is to realize that both the reserves and the bonds are money. They're both created out of nothing by the federal government. They're just a security instrument. And the easiest analogy is to think of it is that reserves are like money in your checking account, and bonds are like money in your savings account. Your savings account money, you're not supposed to be able to move it very easily, but it pays you a higher interest rate. The checking account money, it can be moved easily, but it doesn't pay you as much of an interest rate. In terms of how the federal government handles its own balance sheet, all they're doing is, okay, the reserves are in this column or row, and the bonds are in this column or row, and they're just switching numbers back and forth. That's it.
Yeah.
They're both money. Yeah.
Yeah, money is kind of like a zero interest perpetual bond. You could also look at it that way.
That's a great way to put it.
the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook, and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't one penny in there.
Right, because the Federal Reserve is the institution that is charged with creating the money out of nothing. That's what they do.
Yeah.
Right. Although I do want to give him some credit here, is that he's making an allusion to the point that there's kind of this convoluted system to get this
Yeah, yeah,
done.
yeah.
I completely agree that the system is way too convoluted. There's too many steps in it, and I mean, the bonds don't even need to be there if we want to get down to the real
Exactly.
situation.
Yeah,
You don't even need bonds.
he's assigning too much significance to this event that he's describing there. Is what I
Right.
would say. Not everything's wrong that he's saying, but he's overly dramatic about the fact that the Federal Reserve buys bonds back that the Treasury just sold to the public sector. So this kind of shows you that the whole thing is a wash. It doesn't need to happen because the
All
Federal
that's all these
Reserve.
steps in the middle. You mean?
Right. I mean, none of this needs. The bonds aren't even. If the Fed takes the bonds out of the private sector, then they don't exist for all practical purposes. And then people say, "Oh, but the Fed earns the interest on the bonds and they make profits." Well, they send 98% of their profits back to the Treasury. So it's
Which you can
really,
find out by looking at the publicly available profit and
yeah,
losses that are on the Federal Reserve website.
really a pointless operation that maybe you could say it's a relic of an archaic system where there used to be a gold standard where the different countries tried to incentivize people to not turn in their gold so that not turn in their paper for gold so that the country treasury would have a lot of gold in it, and so for that purpose countries used to issue bonds that pay interest in order to discourage you from taking your money and demanding actual gold and hard gold from the government or from the banks,
Right.
which acted on behalf of the government.
And I think that the point that you made about he's being overly dramatic about something that's technically true, yes, the Federal Reserve writes a check from an account that has $0 in it, but this isn't that big of a deal because it's like a scoreboard at a ball game. Like, okay, a team scored a point plus 3 points.
Hmm.
Oh, where did you get those points from? You don't,
Yeah,
you don't have any points back there. I
yeah. I
mean,
mean,
the Federal Reserve is just keeping track of
or Monopoly.
points.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or think of Monopoly, the bank in Monopoly. Where did they get that money? Well, they didn't get it from. They have it. They just it's their job to keep score, to be a scorekeeper. Um, there is actually some legitimacy to the concern. I would say that, but this goes back to a political science matter, which is the fact that we have all these independent agencies in the government that metastasize and create their own fiefdoms, their own bureaucracies, beholden to nobody elected. Federal Reserve is an example of that, right? So there's
right,
room for corruption within the Fed, and who knows what goes on under the hood. But this operation that he's describing is not one of the things I'm concerned about. But what I'm concerned about is generally the concept of having an agency that is answerable, that has all the privileges and the monopoly position, support of the federal government, but none of the responsibilities of being answerable to the elected officials that are
correct.
supposedly
Which
running
is,
the
to
government.
reemphasize what you said, is not unique to the Federal Reserve in the slightest bit.
Right. The
Yeah,
Federal Reserve, right, it's one symptom of that. And also, if we recall the documentary Masters of the Yen, which I believe was narrated oh no, it was based on a book by Professor Richard Werner.
Richard
Um,
Warner for non-German speakers.
yeah. And he discusses how the Japanese central bank used to be under control of the treasury, and that is how things are supposed to be in a let's say we're statist, okay? So we accept there's a statist economy, there's a government taxes and spends and all that. The way things are normally supposed to work is the Federal Reserve is supposed to be under the treasury. That's totally fine and totally normal. They're not supposed to be this independent agency that we all have to guess and fret over. Oh my God, what are they going to do next? Where are the interest rates going to be this quarter and that quarter? Not supposed to be that way. It's not totally unnecessary. It's all to create volatility, I guess. My opinion, for certain people and certain groups of people to maybe partially insider trade and make a bunch of money.
Well, and then to that point, this is another thing that he's in a sense getting accurate, but he's getting all the details wrong, which is to say, okay, there's this group of elites that are extracting basically the productive capacity of everybody. I don't necessarily disagree with that,
Yeah,
but it's not happening the way that he's describing it.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
not
because with all this rigmarole and goofiness of selling the bonds to these guys, turn around and reselling it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve's constantly changing the interest rates, and people are freaking out on are they going to change it or not. There's so much room in there for someone a big player who actually knows what's going on, to be like, I can make so much money off of this volatility. Boom, 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 boom.
for
Right?
sure. For
And it's
sure.
all nonsense. The whole thing. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, we don't even need bonds.
Yeah, just so people understand where we're coming from, we don't need
Yeah,
bonds, and we don't need the Federal Reserve to subsidize people with money by offering risk-free interest to them. The risk-free interest rate would naturally fall to zero if the Federal Reserve were to not intervene. If we had a free market in the interbanking system, to the extent that there's a free market possible, of course, it's all government run, but if we just had a free market for reserves within the banking system, there would always be excess reserves, and the risk-free interest rate will always be 0%. The reason why it's not is because the Federal Reserve decides to sell bonds into the banking system, which brings down the price of treasury bills, which creates an interest rate to begin with. So this quarterly interest or whatever monthly interest rate that they occasionally decide on, that's what that is. That is them telling us, here's at what price we're going to sell treasury bills and or pay reserves, pay interest on reserves, and that is completely
that's the
arbitrary
floor.
and unnecessary.
Yeah.
They think they're fighting inflation when they raise the interest rate, and they think they're stimulating the economy when they drop the rates. There's no evidence for any such mechanism. There's no such causation that's ever been established. There's not even such a correlation observable in the empirical data.
Let's keep going. That was a lot.
To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, when you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money.
Which is literally
The Fed
its job.
then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence.
Correct.
The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up. Now, it's very important that you understand
who's
this.
buying more
The powers
bonds
that be do
Oh,
not.
I clicked the wrong spot. Go ahead while I scroll around.
He said now somebody buys more bonds at the next Treasury auction. Can we listen to that
Play it
one more
again.
time?
All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up. Now, it's very important that you understand that on
It was
which
before
that
that.
check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check?
There's no,
Okay.
it's no
My
such
understanding
thing.
is they got paid and then they took their new money and reinvested it.
So they sold bonds to the Fed. Right. Okay, they sold bonds to the Fed, got cash, and then they used that cash to buy bonds at the next Treasury auction. And that's basically what banks do all day, I guess, is what he's suggesting. That is their main operation of they don't loan to business, they don't loan to individuals, they don't have, I mean, these are some back end operations that he describes there of what banks might do in their reserve account to some extent. By the way, we discussed in 2022 how a couple of banks ran into trouble because they moved too much short-term money into long-term bonds, and then this 2022, I believe, interest rate assault by the Fed launched. Basically, they started hiking rates from 0 to 5% over the course of a year. Was very surprising to the market. Very much a sabotage operation on the market, unconstructive sabotage operation on the market. Ostensibly to fight inflation, which
Did the opposite. Yeah.
did the opposite. Inflation kept on going. It stopped when the oil price had reached its peak, and obviously now we've sort of coming down because Trump is all about drill baby drill and all that stuff. So prices are coming down again. But Um, Again, he's describing some potential back-end operation, but this is not how banks make the majority of their money. So
Well,
also,
go ahead.
yeah, what is a no? I think this is
Well,
fine.
it goes back to what you said, that he's overly dramatizing just this totally mundane procedure. Where
Mhm.
again, if you just think
Mhm.
about it as okay, checking account and savings account, the bonds are the savings account, and then the reserves are the checking account. Yeah, the banks move it back and forth all the time. Who cares,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I mean, some people, I mean, for example, I would say that we learned in 2022 that it was a bad idea for them to move so much money from short term to long term bonds just because they want to squeeze out a little extra interest.
Hmm.
I personally think that probably taught us that the reserve account should always be in some sort of short term money, maybe maximum 1 year treasury bills. But that's not what this guy's talking about. So
Yeah.
we can continue.
A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up. Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you. The Treasury issues IOUs, bonds. The banks then buy those IOUs with currency. The Federal Reserve then writes IOUs, checks, and hands them to the banks in exchange for the Treasury's IOUs, the bonds. And currency is created. So what's really happening is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs, using the banks as middlemen, and abracadabra, presto, currency magically springs into existence. This process repeats and repeats over and over again, enriching the banks and indebting the public by raising the national debt.
Again, I don't know how much this is enriching the banks, like we just talked about, and that the national debt in and of itself, it's not a real debt in the sense that you and I would have a debt. It's just kind of measuring, okay, this is how many bonds exist.
And it's also not really necessarily the banks buying these bonds. It's like I said, it's you and me. It's every retiree. It's everyone investing money into bonds, which doesn't necessarily have to be limited to banks.
Again, overly dramatizing it. And like we said before, yes, this process is kind of convoluted and it doesn't need to happen this way. And he's actually showing that what we just argued about before is that this whole thing in the middle, it just cancels out because what's happening is that the
Right.
U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve are engaged in a process, and there's these unnecessary steps in the middle to make that happen.
The system is easier to understand if you consolidate the Federal Reserve's and the Treasury's balance sheet. Not only is it easier to understand, it also makes more sense that way.
The end result is that there's a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. This process is also where all paper currency comes from. The Federal Reserve and the government mistakenly call it base money because they didn't watch episode 1 of this series,
Oh, that's why they
and they
don't know.
don't know the difference between money and currency. But I will correctly refer to it as base currency because it is not money. It is currency, and as we've learned, there is a big difference. Money has to be a store of value and maintain its purchasing power over long periods of time.
Why?
We learned in episode 1 that earlier in our history, our paper currency was just a claim check. It was a representation for real money of intrinsic value, the gold and silver that was held on deposit at the Treasury. You could walk into any bank.
Hold on. I hate this conversation about intrinsic value.
Yeah.
And I mean, you just immediately dive into this philosophical abyss when you argue about whether or not money has intrinsic value. Because on one hand, you say, well, the gold is real and therefore it has real intrinsic value because it's in demand. And then the philosophical counterpart to that is, well, there's no such thing as intrinsic value because you need human beings to subjectively put their values on stuff that's just there. And you get into this big squabbling match over whether or not there's such a thing as intrinsic value. And from our point, we don't even have to touch that because I don't even need to use the word value. I could just use demand. Whatever the government says the money is, whether it's gold or silver or paper or digits or dirt, or doesn't matter, right? The fact that they demand it as a tax is what causes the demand for the currency. Pay it or else. Oh, I guess I need it in order to function in society.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
also, one thing he's kind of ignoring is maybe he's going to get to that, but he said that currency springs into existence because reserves end up at the banks, but that's not really the currency that affects Main Street. That's not the money that circulates through the economy. That money is created through bank lending and through government deficit spending and through current account surpluses, not through this back end process that he's getting all excited about here. And yes, he's now obviously inevitably getting to the gold standard, which is obviously that's to a large
The red
extent
herring.
this video is all about. Right, this guy is one of the typical cliche gold bugs who is going to tell you
Sells
at the
gold.
end
Yeah.
of the video the solution to this whole system is that you have to buy gold from him. And we've discussed that at nausea on our show, that there has been off and on a system called the gold standard, which is a fiat money system where the government fixes the price of gold, which is arbitrary, right? It's just as arbitrary. If people want to say, well, the government money is arbitrary, okay, having a fiat money system with these $20 claim checks, and you can get so and so much gold for that money, that means in effect that the federal government is intervening in the gold market to fix the price of gold. Why is that necessary? You're shifting from one arbitrary element to
Why
another,
gold? Right? Gold is just
right?
some metal in the ground that you arbitrarily
And
picked.
it's
Oh yeah,
not like,
it has certain qualities. Blah 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 blah. Okay, fine, but you still
right.
arbitrarily picked it.
It has these. Obviously, we know the what's this story called, the Austrian regression
Bar-
theorem
yeah, the
and the
barter's
barter
theory turning
theory
into
of
money.
money, which says that primitive humans began the market by bartering, chickens against cows, and nuts versus tea or whatever. And in this process of these competing goods, the most homogeneous and fungible and durable and a couple of other attributes, whatever items, emerged as the most suitable medium of exchange. And so, because it has to have been that way, we know that gold and silver were the original money.
And
And
damn the evidence. Yes.
right. So that's why we just assume that it was cat, even though there's zero evidence for it historically, anthropologically. We have way more evidence that the money system has always been a fiat money system. And I'm just trying to convey what somebody like him, where he's coming from when he thinks that, oh, this original perfect money was gold. And so it was the perfect system to have gold claim checks. By the way, why gold? Why wouldn't we then ideally be trading bags of gold dust and gold pieces
Right.
or
If
little
gold
gold?
is so much more valuable, why didn't we claim it when we could?
Right.
Well, and then I mean, just to the point, like this idea that the gold standard limits the money supply. Well, it only does it so in a way that hurts everybody, and the second that the state wants to go to war, they just throw it out the window.
Right, right. So
Like it's just time and time again. That's what happens.
the gold standard limits the money supply, but is that always necessarily a good thing to limit the money supply? Because you know
No,
what also limits the money supply? Taxing the shit out of you also limits the money. Is that a good thing necessarily? No, of course not. Um, Thanks for covering this. You guys are. Oh wow, thank you. Nolly Western has just given us a compliment. Um, what was I saying? Is gold?
yeah. The fact that the gold supply supposedly doesn't expand unless you actually dig it out of the ground.
Right. So then that's a single variable optimization. We want to minimize the money supply growth, right? So and that's what we have to optimize for. It's like during the lockdowns, we have to optimize for minimal cough infections in this country. Everything
And that's
else
the
be
only
damned.
variable that matters. Yes.
Exactly. Or the climate tards. They say we have to optimize for CO2 emissions and everything else be damned. That's a single variable optimization approach, which is idiotic, and it's designed for idiots because idiots can be presented a single simple number that they then get excited about meeting the
Graph
goals.
goes up or graph goes down. My
Number, yeah,
emotions go
number
up or
met,
my
number
emotions
not.
go down. That's it. Yes.
Right.
And then to give a concrete example of that, I think this is important. I've interviewed Dr. E. Michael Jones on his book, um, Barren Metal: The Conflict, the history of. I can't remember the subtitle. He wrote this book called Barren Metal, which basically he makes an argument for why usury is bad and how usury has been used to exploit the working class since time immemorial. It's from a Catholic perspective. It was very interesting. And we're not here to talk about usury today, but the point that we're making right here is this gold standard and whether or not a money supply should or shouldn't expand and contract. Specifically on the gold standard, I believe there was in the United States a depression in 1878. If you're typing quickly, you can look up whether or not I got that date right. But uh, Dr. Jones' argument, he's got a chapter specifically on it, is that there was this push for a gold standard, and the agricultural community couldn't handle it because the agricultural community needed to be able to expand the credit they had in the spring in order to buy all the seeds and the fertilizer and stuff that they need, where they can turn around and then cash it out in the fall or whatever that they harvest. And so that this ability for the money supply to expand and contract was necessary for the agricultural system to be able to do what it does. And when they switched to the gold standard, where okay, now it's fixed and we can't expand and contract, there was this massive, what's the word I'm looking for, catastrophe in the agricultural sector, and it caused a depression. So that this, like Nima was saying, this idea that hey, that we have this one thing, and we got to make sure that the money supply is equal to the money supply, and therefore it retains its value. I mean, that's a factor to consider on the table, but to say that it's the only factor and everything else be damned, you get an example like I just described.
Yeah, I see. 1873 was a panic. Maybe that's what.
Maybe that was it.
Yeah.
I'm
So
quoting it
yeah,
from memory.
just to be, and there was also depression of 1882 through 1885. So maybe what he's talking
Yeah,
about.
somewhere it's one of those. I don't remember which.
Weird. So what I kind of appreciate of the MMT approach is that they're saying we want to optimize for the variable of full employment, and I think that is a less arbitrary variable to optimize for,
I
because
agree.
right, because there's so much misery comes due to unemployment. And we went through the list doesn't end. It's not just monetary issues, but life expectancy, drug abuse, domestic violence, crime, incarceration,
The
all
ability to
kinds.
form a family to create the next generation,
And to have
right?
a meaning in life and sharpen your brain and your skills, and all these things are important. So you could say that, okay, that's also arbitrary, okay, but I think it's less arbitrary
Well, I
than.
don't think it's arbitrary because Nima, remember, what's the cause of unemployment?
Exactly,
This
exactly,
money system in the beginning is what causes the
exactly.
unemployment.
The taxation causes the
Yeah.
unemployment. So the whole premise of the system is we are going to employ you so that you can pay us the damn taxes and have some money left over to save and live a comfortable life. So yeah,
Well, that's what we want, right? I think the whole premise of the system is what you said in the first thing, which is how do I extract resources from my slaves,
yes,
right? And then now we live in this modern age where the government is supposed to be for and by the people, and then we've added this thing to it of you should be making decisions that benefit me too, as one of the peasant class or whatever.
true.
But yes, yeah,
Even if you just look at it just cold-heartedly as a machine that needs to function, the whole premise of the system is based on employment. So yeah, I think optimizing for full employment and optimizing for full employment will also solve a lot of other problems. Now,
right.
going back, so what this guy is going to talk about later is how this system is inflationary and how the banks profit from this inflation, um, because they get the money first, but they make loans. They don't spend the money on consumer goods and investment goods necessarily. They mostly make loans, and loans generally carry a fixed interest rate. This is why most knowledgeable historians have written about how banks have generally favored the banking lobby. Carol Quigley writes about this in Tragedy and Hope, that the banking lobby has generally favored an austerity, low inflation, a gold standard system in many cases. This is where this comes from. It's because when inflation goes up, it actually tends to benefit industry and agriculture much
Debtors.
more. Yeah. What was
Yes.
it?
It benefits the debtors, not the creditors,
Yes. Um,
because it's easier to pay back the loan.
yeah,
There's more money available to pay back a loan that was made when the money was more valuable.
and it's a price allocation. The money goes, so the agricultural sector can command higher prices, so they make more money. The industry sector can command higher prices, so they make more money. So in a sense, you could argue that inflation actually is the last thing that the banking lobby wants, and it's actually much rather what the agricultural sector and the industry sector. Agricultural is not that relevant anymore nowadays. Um, and as far as okay, but the money you earn declines, but under full employment, you can command a higher salary. And guess what? That's what happens when inflation goes up. Incomes also tend to go up with it over the long term. And on top of that, what's always ignored is that you can put your money in a portfolio where, even if it's just a savings account right now, uh, earns about 4% if you put it in a treasury money market fund, treasury only short term money market fund, earns about 4%. The reference interest rate is about 4.25 to 4.5%. And the inflation rate, it has dropped to something like 2.9%. It may even be lower. The next reading may surprise a lot of people, in my opinion. That's just speculation. But there's this chart, this crypto project called Trueflation, which measures. I think the number they measure is pretty good, um, and they have suggested the inflation, and they track it daily. And according to their chart, it has just dropped to something like 1.3 or 1.5%. So anyway, my point is just at the moment you actually earn. So they're saying it's 1.46% right now. If you want to throw it up real quick, but actually we don't have to get bogged down with that.
Yeah. Let me keep us where we're at here.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
but I mean, I think your point is well taken, which is, why is inflation the most important variable that we have to
So yes. So
tackle
here, right.
when it has these horrible side effects for everybody trying to live?
Right. So once again, single variable optimization. There's a correct inflation rate. So this is coming from free market people, oftentimes, right? So free market people are saying that there's a correct price level. Why? I thought the market is supposed to determine prices. Anyway, we can continue.
I will continue.
And slap your currency, like say a $20 bill, on the counter and redeem it for real money, a $20 gold piece. But now,
Whoa. Okay. This is what drives me crazy. Okay, blah, 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 blah. And you said it right. So the currency, the $20 bill is the fake money, and the $20 gold piece is the real money. Well, then why did you measure it in dollars?
Because it's ultimately a fiat money system where the gold price is fixed. That's how I always describe the gold standard.
That's it. And then I think we need to remind everybody what the word fiat means. It means decree,
Yeah.
right? Any
Yeah.
money that a government has, that's what they decreed. So all money systems are fiat systems.
Yeah.
That's what the word means. Okay. Before I get bogged down again, I'm going to play.
base currency that's piling up back here is really nothing but a receipt or a claim check on an IOU, that bond. So it's really nothing but a supply of numbers.
Well, what's wrong with that?
The Treasury then deposits the newly created currency into the various branches of the government, and the politicians say, hey, thanks for that.
It's
And the
not
government
IOU
does some
bond.
deficit spending.
Say it again.
So just to be clear, cash money is not an IOU for a bond. The government doesn't promise you necessarily bonds at a fixed price for $1 because the interest rate can change, the prices can change. But what they do promise is the discharging of a $1 tax liability. So in that sense, a dollar is an IOU. When the government spends a dollar into existence, they promise that with $1 you'll be able to discharge $1 of tax liability.
Correct. Which is also why, again, I appreciate the MMT standpoint, is it gives a very concrete description of what the value of any given money is. Because
Mhm.
the classical, the neoclassical, the Austrian viewpoint, there's always this, well, today's money is based off of what yesterday's money was worth, and yesterday was based on the day before, and the day before was based on the day before, and like there's this infinite
Turns
regression
all
of
the way
like, hey, it's
down.
turtles, turtles, turtles all the way down,
Yeah.
which I mean, that's just nonsense. Versus when you look at the MMT version, we say, okay, what we're doing is we're creating a unit of measurement for measuring debts, and it's equal to the amount of debt we say it will extinguish.
Yeah.
Done. Right
Yeah.
now, the market can turn around and say, okay, well, this is what we think, everything's worth based on, how much that we have left over. But at the end of the day, the core value of whatever that currency is how much debt it can extinguish
Yeah.
to the taxing authority that says, hey, you owe us the taxes in this decreed arbitrary unit.
Yeah.
Spending on public works, social programs, and war. The government employees, contractors, and soldiers then deposit their pay in the banks. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but when you deposit your currency with the bank, you're not actually depositing it into an account to be safely held in trust for you. Instead, you're actually loaning the bank your currency.
I think that's technically
And
true.
within certain legal limits, they can do with it pretty much anything they please. This includes gambling in the stock market and loaning it out, at a profit, of course.
That was half true.
Yeah.
They can gamble it on the stock market, I think. I don't know what regulations are
No.
associated with it, but they
No,
can't
no.
loan it out. That's not how loans work.
Neither of those two. So you will always have a claim on the money that's in your checking account. It's not, they don't siphon that money out of your checking account and put it in stocks, right? Now,
Mm-hmm.
the reserves, they have a reserve account where they have some flexibility on whether they keep the reserve at the Federal Reserve, or if they buy Treasury bill, or even if they buy longer term bonds. As I explained earlier, it wasn't such a good idea in 2022 if you were First Republic Bank or Silicon Valley Bank. Caused a lot of problems there. But generally speaking, he's gonna get into the fractional reserve.
Right. Okay. Let's get into it, and we can save our
Glory.
vitriol for that.
Yeah, yeah,
Now, this is where the machine of currency creation really gets cranking, because this is where something called fractional reserve lending comes into play. Fractional
No, it
reserve
doesn't.
lending is exactly what it says. The banks are allowed to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and loan the rest out. Although reserve ratios may vary, I'm going to use a 10% reserve ratio as our example. If you deposit $100 in your account, the bank can legally take $90 of it and loan it out without telling you. The bank must hold $10 of your deposit
Without
in
telling
reserve just in case you want some of it. These reserves are called vault cash. But why does your bank account still say you have $100 if the bank has stolen $90 of it?
Stolen.
Because the bank left IOUs it created, called bank credit, in its place. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but here it is in black and white from the Fed. Commercial banks create checkbook money when they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU.
not what
Yeah,
you
and
just said.
it doesn't follow that they took your deposit money
Right.
in order to do that.
Right. No, so that's accurate. So once again, this is the symptom of partially true, but not accurate.
Focusing on the wrong part. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the fractional reserve story flips reality on its head. So he's suggesting that banks wait for a deposit and then lend out that deposit, which is actually the opposite of how it works. The bank makes a loan out of nothing, out of thin air, and then they will find the funding sources for those reserves that they will then have to transfer. Once the check's written, the recipient's bank will come to bank A and ask them for the reserves, and where they get those reserves from. Well, there's multiple options they have. They can go to the Federal Reserve directly, which is the worst, the most expensive. They can get it on the interbank lending market. They can attract savings accounts, or they can attract even better checking accounts. This is why banks oftentimes compete for your checking account money and provide incentives in order for you to put your money in their checking accounts. Like, for example, I have a safe deposit box at the bank across the street. They give me they actually
No, there's no fee if you keep a certain amount of checking
it's
money
not,
with them.
sorry, it's not
Yeah.
across the street. It's like way over in other part of the country. Um, but I just I just misspoke. But yeah, because so they'll give you incentives. They'll give you like 50% off the annual fee, and you pay very little for it. So that kind of stuff they do, because for checking account money, they don't pay you any interest. That's the cheapest form of bank reserves they can attract. They can have clearing their way in order to be able to meet clearing demands, tax payments, and bank withdrawals.
Nima, keep talking. I got to use the bathroom. Give me 2 minutes.
Oh boy. Okay, so
What he talked about the reserve rate. Maybe this is a good
yeah,
time to
yeah,
talk about how the reserve rate does nothing for
yeah. Right,
how banks loan or don't loan.
right. So he's suggesting that there's this mechanism where there's a uh, um, deposit. What's it called? A reserve rate. Let's call it. I forgot what it's exactly called. Reserve ratio of 10%. Right. So the bank takes $100, and now they're allowed to loan out $90. So they immediately turn around and loan out the $90. So this is like I've learned this shit in college too, in economics undergrad classes, and even graduate classes to some extent, um, where there's this mathematical formula by which we can tell how much loans grow within the banking system, which is not a thing. The banks don't loan $90 of money because you just deposited $100 of money in their bank accounts. Bank loan officers don't care how much money depositors have put in the bank's checking account. They are busy looking for willing and able borrowers who are good credit risks or medium credit risks, and whatever credit risk, charge them in a risk appropriate rate uh, in order to secure a loan, and then they will earn a revenue through the interest that they earn on that. Whatever happens on the deposit side is a separate section of the banking business that has nothing to do with what the loan officer does. So what he's let's continue because it gets even worse, and I want to poke fun at
Okay,
something.
and then I just want to add, I agree. I agree with everything that Nima just said that I didn't hear.
These are
So
nothing but numbers that the banks type into their computers.
Correct.
And even though these bank credit IOU numbers are very different from base currency numbers because they only exist in computers, they are still currency. So now there is $190 in existence. Now, the reason people take out loans from the banks is to buy something. They're going to buy a house or a car or something like that. So the borrower takes the $90 that the bank loaned to him from your account, and he pays the seller of the item. But then the seller deposits that currency into his account, and his bank loans out 90% of that and leaves bank credit numbers in its place. So now there's $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats until under a 10% reserve ratio, an initial deposit of just $100 can create up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by $100 of vault cash, just 10%. But as I said, reserve ratios vary wildly. On some deposits, it's 10%, on others, it's 3%, and on some forms of deposits, reserve requirements are 0. The result is that the expansion of the currency supply by the banks is far greater than even this example would lead you to believe.
Well, and he doesn't even recognize the inherent fallacy in what he just said.
well, number
If
one,
it's 0, then there should be infinite money already.
exactly. I was thinking the same thing. If there's zero on some deposits, then how comes that automatically turns into infinite money circulating in the economy? Because that's not how bank loans work. Banks make loans, like I said, when they find willing and able borrowers. Now, also, what I like about this illustration here. So, Dylan, have you ever gone to a bank and the bank goes, oh, sorry, we've already loaned out all the $90,
Right.
but to the
Right.
other,
No.
the bank 10 blocks down the street, they are still in the process of loaning out the fractional reserve money. If you run over there, you might be able to get a loan there, right? Not
No.
how this works. It's a fiction.
Yeah, and then we've discussed this in other shows as well, is that this reserve ratio is really just arbitrary nonsense. It,
An observation in hindsight, basically. So there happen to be reserves in the system against loans made, but that is an afterthought. That's not the beginning of the system. And like as we've pointed out many times, in Canada, there is a zero reserve ratio, by the way, because some countries have institutionalized reserve ratios, others don't. Canada has a zero reserve ratio. It doesn't change anything fundamentally about the system.
yeah. And then I don't know if you mentioned it while I was using the bathroom, but they make the loans first and they turn around and find the reserves later. And the way that the
Yeah.
system is set up, the reserves are always available.
Yes.
So the,
There's no
the, the
bottleneck.
limiting factor is, like you said, the ready and willing borrower. And on the, I mean, I guess on, for example, a home or a car loan, they look at your income and say, well, we think you can afford it or not. Or if you're going to acquire a business, they say, well, okay, well, show us the financials of the business. Or are you going to start a business and say, show us a pro forma? Do we think that you're going to be able to end up paying on this loan based on how much we believe in you and your system or whatever? And they create the money out of nothing. And the fact that they turn around and use that money to generate economic prosperity. Honestly, this brings up what we've heard from Richard Werner, to bring him up again, is that when money is created for businesses, that's actually not technically inflationary, because you're increasing the goods and services with the money creation, versus if you're just making your system is making a bunch of loans on assets, whether that's stocks or houses or cars or RVs or whatever. You're throwing more and more money at a limited supply of goods. So
Mhm.
asset lending, creating money to buy assets, is inherently inflationary, versus creating money to fund or start businesses is inherently not inflationary. I thought that was a brilliant point made
It's
by
possible.
Warner.
It's an interesting theory. There's also theories that suggest that actually business lending is inflationary for different reasons. Because
Mm.
if you lend money to a business that manufactures machinery, they employ people to build the machinery, but the machinery does not hit the consumer market. But the
Oh, I
people,
guess it depends on what type of business it is. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So if it's investment goods, investment spending in the economy tends to have an inflationary effect, according to Randy Ray of the MMT. He's from the University of Louisiana or something. I forgot where exactly, but or Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. Yeah. He suggests that if the sum of deficit spending plus investment spending plus current account surpluses as a percentage of GDP rises, that is inflationary. And there's because, like I said, the people who are employed in the machinery business, they still go out and buy consumer goods, but they didn't add any new consumer goods. So that could
Right.
have some inflationary effect right there. But I also think Richard Werner's theory has merit, because obviously, same situation. If you lend money for an asset and nothing new has been produced and no consumer goods have been produced, so, and even worse yet, you haven't even added any capital goods that could improve worker productivity and drop prices in the long run. So yeah, I can totally see that lending
Yeah,
for
well,
assets.
I think that was the point I wanted to make is, okay, yes, it's inflationary to invest in capital goods, but the idea is at some point it's going to be deflationary, because those capital goods are going to be producing consumer goods,
Correct.
theoretically. Yeah. Let's keep going.
So once again, when currency is deposited in the banks get to lend it out, and then it gets redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent over and over again, creating bank credit all the way.
And just to reemphasize, this is completely and utterly factually inaccurate.
This is where the vast majority of our currency supply comes from. In
We
fact,
got a question.
92 to 96%.
What's that?
With a question from Jesus. So lending for business purposes is deflationary, and lending for consumption inflationary. Is that what you guys are trying to say? Just to make sure I'm grasping it. I
No, not
think,
quite. Yeah.
yeah, I think lending for business in the long term can have a deflationary effect if the worker productivity improves as a result of that business, because then prices can come down. But that doesn't happen while the business is being built up, while people are employed there, while they go out and go shopping with their money, while
Well,
not adding to consumer goods. So
and it's not necessarily deflationary. Maybe it's just neutral.
long term it could be neutral, but
Yeah.
if you have a bunch, if you have a big investment boom in a country, that is likely to have an inflationary effect. If you have a big rise in investment spending vis-a-vis total GDP, that could be inflationary in the beginning. It's not
Right.
necessarily a hard and fast rule or whatever. Now, lending for consumption, I think, can be inflationary, um, because well, because you're giving someone money who hasn't worked, who hasn't produced anything themselves, and he's just buying up consumer goods. Similar situation right there as the business lending or whatever. In every one of these scenarios, you're loaning money to somebody who hasn't produced anything in the consumer sector. And so, yeah, these can all be can all have inflationary effects.
Yes.
Now,
But
you could also have a situation where the industry capacity of the country is very large and underutilized, and it doesn't take much to spin it up, which in
and
the
so you
US
need
right
that
now,
extra consumer spending in order to, yeah,
right.
increase the productive
So
capacity.
then maybe consumer spending is not necessarily inflationary, you know.
It goes back to what you said that there's no one variable
Hmm.
solution here. Like
Yeah,
there's
I
a
mean,
bunch of variables that you have to move around on the table to say, okay, if we
yeah.
do this, we do this, we do that, we're gonna have this effect or that effect.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna continue.
Percent of all currency in existence is created not by the government, but here in the banking system.
True.
Now, massive amounts of currency spewing into society may at first sound like a fun idea. That is, until you remember one of the most important hidden secrets of money from episode 1, that the prices of everyday goods and services act as a sponge on an expanding currency supply. The more currency we have, the more prices rise. This
How many times do we have to go over this, Nima? Eh.
Mhm.
It depends on productive capacity and unemployment.
Yeah, it depends on a whole array of factors. I mean, prices
Yeah.
can go up. So for non-monetary, so he's gonna now start talking about how the real inflation is just the supply of money. So he's redefining the term inflation, which is an increase in aggregate prices, to now mean that it's just the money supply rising equals inflation. So now he's made everything he's saying right by declaration, by definition, but it's not very helpful. Also, by the way, there has been research done on the causality of all of this. For example, in Weimar Germany, when the country's productive capacity was destroyed
By the
by
French,
the French moving in on the east and extracting all the coal,
the West.
and also the country having to pay off this giant foreign debt, which basically extracts resources from the country, is impossible foreign debt to other countries. So you reduce the country's productive capacity. Yeah, that'll cause some hyperinflation. But what, and I forget the exact site researcher who suggested this. I can dig it up, I guess. But it does make sense that when prices go up, everything becomes more expensive. Now the government also has to print more money in order to be able to purchase these things. So it's possible the causality is actually inverse. The prices go up, and then more money has to be created in order to pay for these prices, and the money supply rises because of supply side shocks that have caused price to go up. By the way, we also saw in 2022 big inflation started as a result of the sanctions on Russia and the disruptions in the global availability of oil and natural gas, which was a basically self-imposed restriction, and thus prices for oil went up big time, and that caused high inflation, especially in countries that can't produce their own oil, such as Germany. They had like 9% inflation. I think the US had a 7% inflation in 2022.
And which
So
is of course on the tail end of COVID, where everything got shut down for no stupid
that's
reason.
another
Yeah.
factor. COVID, it was a huge amount of stupidity in the supply chain, shutting things down, making people wear a mask because of a cough, and or if the business was even allowed to operate, a lot of them had to shut down for a while out of arbitrary
So that's
um,
shutting down productive capacity.
trying out
Yeah.
productive capacity. So yeah, these things definitely caused some inflation at that time.
And then before I click play again, I do want to emphasize this. It drives me absolutely bonkers when someone defines inflation as the increase in the money supply. I mean, like you said, you're just making something equal to itself. One is equal to one. Yes, we know. If you say increasing the money supply causes inflation, and then the next sentence out of your mouth is inflation is defined as the increase in the money supply. You're saying, well, increasing the money supply increases the money supply.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
It makes the conversation completely meaningless to
It does.
use
Yeah,
that as a definition of inflation.
for sure.
Is where inflation comes from. The true definition of inflation is an expansion of the
Yeah, there it
currency
is.
supply. Rising prices are merely the symptom. So our entire currency supply
Again,
is responsible for most of the
I'll find it again. But there is the one variable system that you're talking about, right? The only reason that prices could ever go up is because you've increased the money supply, unlike the list of things that we just said.
Right.
The true definition of inflation is an expansion of the currency supply. Rising prices are merely the symptom. So our entire currency supply is nothing but a couple of bucks whipped up in this hocus-pocus scam where the Treasury and the Federal Reserve swap glorified IOUs and a bunch of numbers that the banks just type into their computers.
Why is that bad?
That's it. That's our entire currency supply. It's nothing but a supply of numbers. Some of them printed, most of them typed.
And if the government decrees it, then that's fine.
And there is nothing else. But if you thought that was crazy, get ready to enter the twilight zone of modern economics. We work for some of that currency supply. True wealth is your time, but we trade away moments of our lives, hour by hour, day by day, and year by year, for numbers that somebody printed on pieces of paper or just typed into a computer.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we can get into a philosophical discussion that, taxation is theft no matter what system that you're looking at. But
I mean, what does he like do? Does he not earn money? I don't know.
okay,
Does
I'll
he
keep
not
going.
sell his gold for money or whatever? I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's actually a good point. If your gold's so valuable and it's worth so, and it's like better than money, why are you selling it?
Now those numbers
Measuring
represent our
money.
blood, sweat, tears, labor, ideas, and talent. We are what gives the currency its value. But here comes the really cruel joke. We work hard so that we can save some of that currency, so that we can pay the tax collector. In the United States, it's known as the IRS. They then turn it over to the Treasury so that the Treasury can pay the principal plus interest on that bond that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it.
Again, it's like half true.
Yeah.
And then the Federal Reserve turns around and gives that profit back to the Treasury. Okay.
Exactly.
Now let's do a recap on this section because this is where the system begins to rob you and I on a massive
We have a
scale.
question.
Much of our taxes are not used.
What's that?
We have a question. Would you say money printing isn't inflationary? It's spending money combined with a gap in production to meet demand. Would that sound a way to explain it to the average person? Yeah, I think
That's what it is optimally.
I think that's a
Right.
fine
You
way.
could print too much money, for sure.
Yeah, it's possible to do too much of it. But yeah, he makes a good point. You can print a bunch of money and burn your backyard. It's not going to be inflation, right? So the spending money is crucial. It has to be spending operation, and that also ties in with QE, for example. QE is not inflationary because it's just a private sector asset swap between, like we explained earlier, savings account money and checking account money. Yeah, Peter Schiff. Why are you accepting dollars going to zero in exchange rate? Yeah, exactly. Peter Schiff.
Yeah, well, and then why is the gold always measured in dollars? Why aren't the dollars measured in gold?
Why don't they measure gold in gold?
Because it's all fiat. It's all by decree.
Used for schools, roads, and public services, but to pay interest on bonds that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it. The Federal Reserve is committing fraud.
Again, that's not what the Federal Reserve does. It's got numbers on this column and numbers on that column, and it just moves the numbers back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with the statement that there's no justification, I guess, for the government to pay interest on their bonds. There's no need for that. I say thank you very much because they pay me risk-free money.
And Nima's got a bunch of bonds. Yeah.
But
so he gets to benefit from it.
There's no practical, moral, political, economic, whatever justification for doing it. It's almost, it's a handout to people who buy bonds, I guess.
But here's one of the biggest secrets of them all. Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, there was no need for personal income tax.
There still isn't a need for a personal income tax. Nah.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and that very same year, the Constitution was amended to allow income tax. Do you really think this was just a coincidence?
Whether it was a coincidence or not, the government doesn't need our income tax.
Yep.
Ask yourself how much income tax you've paid over your lifetime. Much of it has been silently siphoned away into the hands of those who own the system. Yes, this system has owners. Who they are is an even bigger secret that we'll get.
Oh, Nima is my favorite part. He's getting to my favorite part. The system has owners. Yeah, okay.
Get to shortly. But first, we need to understand the mumbo-jumbo of the so-called debt ceiling. It's all based on a huge paradox. There was interest due on that bond, and there was interest due on every one of those loans that the banks made. That means that there is interest due on every dollar in existence. Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet.
But you didn't borrow it into it. I mean, from the banking system, it got borrowed into existence, but from the federal government, it just got spent into existence.
Right.
But you promised to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest. Where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest.
What's that, Nima?
Basically, all money in circulation is either came from a bank loan or from deficit spending or from current account surplus. But yeah, I mean, it's true. It's not nothing nefarious or strange about that. But he's trying to make it look like it is.
As well. So now
it's all predicated on the idea that we have to work to pay it back. If that were true, for example, if we used euros in the United States and the United States didn't have control over its own money supply, this might actually be closer to truth, right?
Yeah.
But we don't. We live in a country that creates its own money supply.
Yeah. So there it is. For example, if we look at the European Union and its economic problems, there are some things that attain more relevance in the debate over there that are not really relevant over here because we are a sovereign money issuer, but the individual European countries are not.
Now there are $2 in existence, but you owe $4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt. There is always more debt in the system than there is currency in existence to pay the debt. Therefore, the whole system is impossible. It is finite. It will come to an end one day. What would happen if the government stopped borrowing to do deficit spending? Are the payments on those treasury bonds going to stop? What would happen if the public stopped borrowing and going deeper into debt? Are your house and car payments going to stop? No. There is a payment due every month on the principal plus the interest on every dollar in existence, and those payments do not stop.
Again, he's partially right with the banking system. But with the federal government money is what makes up the difference. The federal government can inject the private sector net savings to say, okay, there's enough non-debt money in the system to cover those interest payments, because in the banking system that's true. And maybe we can criticize the banking system for this, and maybe there's a better way to do this. But the bank lends out $100 at 7% interest now, and over 30 years that turns into $200 that needs to be paid back. Yeah, there's more debt out there than, or interest plus principal, than there is principal out there to pay for it. And that's why when we see the U.S. government, whenever it tries to balance the budget or to get rid of the national debt or whatever, and it contracts that non-debt money supply, the private sector only has the ability to go to the private sector for money, and that increases the what's the word I want? It's
Private debt.
escaping me.
Yes, it increases private indebtedness to the banking system.
Here's the word I want. It gets to the point where the private sector cannot service its own debt.
Yeah. That is when a debt crisis occurs, which is true. But the cause of it is austerity measures by the government, a lack of net private savings injected. Also, what he's saying, so he's painting this bleak picture of just debt on debt and debt, more debt and interest. But what he's not presenting is the asset side of the equation, that there's assets that are used to generate profits that service that debt.
Right.
That's kind of important to point out. Now, of course, if the debt goes up and up, you don't have more real stuff, more machinery, computers, training, factories, engineers produced as a result. Then that's a problem, but that's not necessarily a given. And generally speaking, that's not the default situation in a capitalist economy. The idea is for the real stuff, the real assets, to be utilized to service part of that debt.
Real quick, Charles Grip is asking, why does the government bother issuing bonds at all? And then, Charles, we went into pretty big detail on that earlier, and for the sake of time, I'm going to ask you to catch the recording for that answer.
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's really no justification for it, is the short answer.
Yes.
If we stop borrowing, then no new currency is created to replace the currency that we used to make those payments. Whether you're making a payment on a loan or paying tax to make a payment on a bond, the portion of the payment that goes to pay off the principal extinguishes that portion of the debt. But the debt also extinguishes the currency. Currency and debt are like matter and antimatter. When they meet, they annihilate each other. If we just pay off the principal only on all the loans and bonds that exist, the entire currency supply just vanishes. So if we don't go deeper into debt every year, look what happens. The whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse under the weight of those payments.
Well, just once again, if we don't go deeper in debt every year, but that only applies if you look at the debt number as an absolute figure. So if by going deeper into debt, you mean the number goes up of the absolute debt, then yeah, we have to go deeper in debt. But what's more relevant is what's the debt to income ratio, right? What is the income that's available to service that debt? Yeah, if that were to drop, if that were to go up and up and up in the economy, that is when debt crises happen. When it's too much debt to income, then that's a problem. By the way, that's not the problem we have in the US right now. The debt leverage has actually been very low ever since around 2014 or so, when it started leveling out. 2009, it was very high. It was like 300% or so, I think. And as part of the housing crisis, that there was a huge period of deleveraging, and it's sort of leveled out at somewhere 230% or so. And we've been staying there for I want to say for probably 12 years or so now. So generally speaking, I would say the private sector is actually not dangerously over leveraged in this country right now.
Charles has another good question here, Neiman. I think you're the best to answer it. Is deficit spending done through issuing bonds?
It's accompanied by issuing bonds, but generally speaking, it just happens via the Treasury writing checks and injecting reserves into the private sector. And then, because they have this belief that deficit spending has to be funded by bonds, they issue bonds after the fact and sell those bonds to the people, or offer the bonds to the cash holders in the private sector, because there's excess reserves in the private sector who can go and chase those bonds. And the banking system is most of deficit spending done through issuing bonds. Yeah, I mean it's
They're two different processes.
they're
People
reconstructing
think
it
that
that
they're
way
linked, but
because,
they're not, and they act like they're linked.
yeah, they
Is
reconstruct it in parallel. Basically, they spend money um, out of a magic account, the Treasury General account, where that's always replenished to about $5 billion or so, I think. And they sell bonds after the fact. There's a whole like ridiculous process that we've actually gone through with Warren Mosler at one point in one episode, which at the end of the day, it comes down to, if you consolidate the balance sheets, the federal government spends money by writing checks to the workers, to the suppliers, and that money ends up increasing the reserves in the private sector. So we have a reserve glut. And then the Federal Reserve sells bonds on the as part of their open market operations to meet the desired interest rate in order to keep it from coming down to zero. And where do they get those bonds? Well, the Treasury issues the bonds. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
So they do it in a way that it looks like it's linked, but it's not.
yeah.
They're totally arbitrary, and they're acting like they're linked.
Well, also,
I
like
mean,
I said earlier, when we run into the debt ceiling, they actually stop issuing bonds, but they still spend money. So yeah, there's that. It's actually possible to spend money without issuing bonds.
I'm going to keep going.
Politicians and pundits alike talk about balancing the budget, paying down the debt, and living within our means. They don't understand that that is deflationary. It is impossible to do under our current monetary
True.
system without collapsing the whole economy.
Yep. Oh, yeah. That's true.
This is why any talk of a debt ceiling is not only ridiculous, it's delusional. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt just to continue. And that's why politicians will always kick the can down the road and raise this so-called debt ceiling over and over again until the whole system finally collapses under its own weight.
So, just as a reminder, the United States is the only country in the world with a debt ceiling.
Yeah.
All the other countries that operate with the same premise, they issue the money and they got the bonds and all this sort of stuff. Nobody else has this thing called a debt ceiling. We're all worked up over nothing about this stupid debt ceiling.
I mean, there's some countries like Europe has a really bad thing, which is the deficit limit, which is actually kind of, you could say, almost worse. But similar situation there, they constantly violate their own rules because they've created rules that the political class doesn't understand, make no sense. And but you can sort of, it should give you a hint, the fact that you keep having to violate that rule, that it's an impractical rule that makes no sense. Same with the debt ceiling. It's a pointless ritual basically in this country, causes a lot of unnecessary problems too in the banking system.
Charles now asks, would you guys support deficit targeting? I don't know what that is. Do you, Nima?
Yeah, no, that's I don't support that because that's arbitrary. That's what the European Union does. I don't know where they stand there right now, but when the European Monetary Union was founded, one of their conditions was that no
Oh, I know what
country
it is now.
yeah,
Yeah.
no country exceeds the 3% deficit limit. Why 3%? Because politicians were sitting at a round table, and Mitterrand said, "Well, the number three is a nice number, the Trinity, blah blah blah." Because these are political people who don't know what they're doing. Um, so no, I absolutely do not support deficit targeting. I support targeting full employment, and in the context of a statist economy, I would support targeting full employment. That should be if any single variable we want to optimize for, I would say that should be the one because it would solve a lot of problems.
In other words, they don't want it to collapse on their watch. The founding fathers of the United States knew the dangers of central banking and fought to free themselves from this very thing.
Just to add, the founding fathers of the United States all fought with each other on the nature of money and how the economy works.
No.
And I mean, to be fair, um, the Wealth of Nations came out in 1776, which is
Yeah.
the year that the United States is created, and it's not like anybody had like the idea of economics as a science is like as old as the United States. So the founding fathers didn't have a whole lot of material to work with. Is the point that I'm trying to get at
Hmm.
in terms of understanding the monetary system.
The Revolutionary War started out as a tax revolt, but now we must pay tax just to.
I have to correct that. The Revolutionary War did not start out as a tax revolt. It started out as a lack of representation revolt. Sorry, that nuance is worth
Well, he's probably
repeating.
talking about the Tea
Yeah,
Party
but
thing,
there's more nuance to the fact that there's a tea tax. The colonies were upset first and foremost because they said, "Hey, if you're going to tax us, give us some representation in Parliament so we can have a say over what happens with these taxes. We're British subjects. Make us a
Yeah,
part of Britain."
no
And then
representation without taxation.
yeah, well, and then even further, I listened to a
No
lecture on
taxation
this.
without representation. Sorry.
I listened to a lecture on this some time ago. Is that the founding fathers were actually looking at what was happening in India with the British East India Company, and what was happening is I might have these details a little fuzzy, but it was something along these lines. Is that more and more of the judicial authority of India was being given to the British East India Company, and the taxing authority was giving to the British East India Company, which of course was turning the whole place into a giant slave plantation. And the colonists were concerned that something similar would happen in the United States because along with this tax on tea, again, I don't remember the specifics, the lecture went over it, was this increased influence of the British East India Company over the United States. So basically, that they were, I mean, obviously they didn't have the lingo at the time, but they're like, no, we don't want fascism.
Yeah.
Right? It was way more to do than just like, we're not going to pay 3% on tea. Rah! Right? It was way more complicated, nuanced, and significant than that.
Hmm.
Have a monetary system. Having just suffered through the hyperinflation of the continental dollar, which was printed into oblivion to finance the Revolutionary War, they understood the dangers of fiat currency.
The continental currency was counterfeited by the British during the war,
It's a sabotage
and
operation.
sabotage operation, and then during a war, which I mean, essentially, we call it the Revolutionary War because we won, but if we had lost, it'd pretty much be a civil war, right? In a civil war where you got both sides fighting each other, and this side wins and takes it, and then this side wins and takes it, you're destroying destroying and B, preventing the productive capacity of the country, right? So you're
Yeah. Also,
doing all this
uh,
military spending, you're preventing productive capacity, you're destroying productive capacity, and you got a counterfeiting operation happening off the coast of New York or Boston or wherever it was. I don't
well,
remember. Yeah, of course you're going to have inflation.
also, what I heard about the Continental is that the government was so weak that they lacked the enforcement abilities to
That
collect
too.
taxes. And so that can also cause hyperinflation if you can't actually collect the tax. We have a question from Charles. Do you guys believe in time preference? I
In what
don't
sense?
necessarily believe in the sense that the Austrians do, like Mises and Böhm Bawerk and Hayek, those people, they believe that there's a market interest rate and it reflects our time preferences. If the um, interest rate was determined on the free market, it would reflect how much money I want, how much a dollar in 10 years is worth to me now. And that manifests in the form of the interest rate, or how much $110 are in a year is worth $100 right now. So that means interest is 10% or something like that. Maybe there's something to that. I mean, certainly it could be true, right? It does make sense that we value present money over future money. but I don't necessarily
The
believe
idea
that.
that there's an agreed upon market value to what that should
Right.
be, I think is nonsense.
But the problem with that is also because the interest rate is so manipulated upward. First of all, the Federal Reserve's interest rate does not reflect time preference. It's always arbitrary. And if it was a market rate, it would be 0%. So it reflects, so to me, interest rate reflects risk also, right? Because banks charge different interest rates for different projects, depending on the riskiness of the project. So it's not just time preference, not just when you get the money back, but also what kind of loan is it? Is it a home equity loan? Is it a personal loan? Is it a business loan? Is it a collateral loan? These all come
What's the business? What's your experience in the business?
right. So
Yeah.
it's a risk premium that you charge, and maybe there's some time preference in there. So I'm not discounting the notion of time preference, just saying that the mathematical way the Austrians look at it, I don't necessarily agree with. Do you think inflation influences time preference? I think so. Yeah. I mean, if you expect prices, if you have some kind of price expectation for a year from now, then you would probably factor that into your loan calculation when you make a loan as a private bank. But once again, like I'm saying, not the risk-free base rate, but rather the risk premium the bank charges. I think that inflation can certainly have an effect there. It would be a good question to ask a loan officer at a bank, or generally a manager at a bank who's in charge of interest rate policy, not in the sense of the Fed word, but in the sense of how does the bank price its loans. I don't see why inflation wouldn't factor into that as well. And it
Yep.
also happens to it happens to factor into the Federal Reserve's interest rate decisions, unfortunately, because the Federal Reserve thinks they fight inflation with higher interest rates. So there certainly it does, but it only because of the ideology of the people who run the banking, the Federal Reserve establishment.
I'm gonna keep going.
Not just for loans, though, for consumer behavior as well. Not just for loans.
Um, Nima and Charles,
Yeah,
before we get down a rabbit hole, we're still halfway through this video.
yeah, yeah.
Let's keep going.
Let's go. Sorry.
I appreciate the questions, though, Charles.
Yeah, yeah.
And debt-based monetary systems. So to protect future generations from institutional theft and out-of-control government, they wrote into the Constitution that
elaborate on
only
that,
gold and
Charles,
silver
maybe I
can
can
be
answer
money for the simple fact that you can't print them.
Was that Nima?
I was just telling Charles if you can elaborate on that question, maybe I can
Okay.
answer it. I don't necessarily understand it right now.
Our current system is not only unconstitutional, but it robs us of the liberty and prosperity our forefathers fought and died for.
I do want to say this about that part where they wrote gold and silver in on the Constitution. I don't understand the nuance well enough. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me
It's
that
for
they wrote that into the
states.
Constitution. What's
It's for
that?
states. So yeah, so the Constitution says that the states are not allowed to make anything but gold and silver into a money. They're not allowed to emit bills of credit, but that doesn't apply to the federal government, as far as I'm aware.
Okay. Well, and then regardless of what they wrote in there, I want to reemphasize the point that the founding fathers were in a very hot, heated argument about how money and um, debt and banking and the economy and all that stuff works, and they may have wrote something dumb into the Constitution because they didn't understand how it worked.
No, but
We are all
this is
Yeah.
kind of because you hear this point of, I think he's making a false claim here that the Constitution prohibits fiat money, and that's not the case. It prohibits the states from issuing fiat money, but not the federal government.
Mm. I will look into that more later. Right now, I want
Yeah,
to keep the video going.
yeah. Maybe I'm wrong, but
feeling the
that's
effects of ignoring the Constitution right now. By forcing more currency into circulation, our purchasing power is diluted. Inflation is a slow and insidious stealth tax that is simply the result of this debt-based monetary system. This system
Again, it's only a result of the debt-based monetary system. It isn't the 4,000 other factors that we could list right now that also contribute to. inflation.
Political factors, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, but I'm sorry. He defined inflation as the increase of the money supply, so I guess he's technically true. He's technically correct by his own definition.
Powers and benefits those who create the currency and receive it first, as they get to spend it into circulation before it has an effect on the economy. They're stealing purchasing power from you and transferring it to the banks and the government every hour of every day because of this false monetary
It's
system.
false.
And it's not like the people at the top don't know this. To quote the Federal Reserve, the decrease in purchasing power incurred by the holders of money due to inflation imparts gains to the issuers of money. This is a fraud. It is a pyramid scheme, it is a Ponzi scheme, it's a scam, and it's a lie. Our entire monetary system is nothing but a form of legalized theft.
Well, in a certain sense, I would agree that taxation is theft, but
Yeah.
I agree nothing on the details that he's put here.
Right.
But here's the biggest con job of them all. The Federal Reserve is not
my favorite
federal.
part.
It has stockholders. There is no federal agency that has stockholders. What's a stockholder? A share of stock represents a percentage of ownership in a corporation. So the stockholders are the owners of that corporation. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation with...
Except the fact that those stockholders have absolutely no say in what the Federal Reserve does, and everybody who does have a say in what the Federal Reserve does is appointed by the government.
owners.
Yeah.
And you can
they're not
see it for
tradable.
yourself.
Stocks can't be
Right.
traded. So he's suggesting here that just because they have stocks, it makes them a completely private corporation, which is not the case.
If you go to the Federal Reserve's website, and it will say, the stockholders receive an annual dividend of 6%. Now we know that the
Which ends up being 2% of the entire money the profit that the Federal Reserve gets, and they send the rest to the U.S. Treasury.
stock in the Federal Reserve was originally issued to the largest banks in the United States. But because of mergers and acquisitions through the years, you can't actually trace who owns the stock in the Federal Reserve.
Well, I'm going to trace it right now. I was ready for this. I'm going to trace this right effing now. This drives me nuts. Okay, I am going to share this tab instead.
Meanwhile,
You see
I'll
this,
answer.
everybody?
Okay.
You can go right here to the FDIC data tool. Okay? You can go to the Bank Find Suite, if I remember this correctly. Find institutions. I'm not going to go through this, but you can start searching specific banks. If you read the Federal Reserve Act, anybody who is a national bank, there's a couple other examples too, but for the most part, any bank that's a national bank, and a national bank is any bank that operates in more than one state, right? They operate in Colorado and they operate in Texas. It's now a national bank. If you're a national bank, you must be a stockholder of the Federal Reserve. So you can literally go online and look up who the stockholders are of the Federal Reserve. It's no effing secret. There's no secret.
Yeah.
Continuing.
That's a very closely guarded secret. My guess would be that the owners are those primary
not
dealers,
very closely
the banks that get to make a profit by selling part of our national debt, those bonds, to the Federal Reserve, who buys them with a check from nothing. Then we pay tax to pay the principal and the interest on those bonds so that the Federal Reserve can pay the banks a 6% dividend.
Yeah, again, that 6% dividend is like this tiny, minuscule amount that the Federal Reserve actually brings in.
Right. It's not how the
Don't
banks.
be alarmed if you don't.
And also, the banks have a limited, like, what's it, 50,000 capital put down or something like that?
Yeah,
to be part of
the
system?
Federal Reserve Act details like exactly how much stock a bank that's a member of the Federal Reserve has to buy. It's completely arbitrary, written in the act, and it's not like they're not getting a six. Actually, I think this is disingenuous here. They're not getting a 6% dividend of all the profits. It's not like, okay, the Federal
what
Reserve.
they're holding.
Yeah, it's what they get 6% on the $50,000 that they put up front.
Right.
That's
Right.
not a lot of money.
No, it's a nominal amount, and the point of it is rather a buy-in more than anything, right? Because otherwise, every bum from the street could show up and say, "Hey, I want to be a
Bank
member
with
of
money
bank."
creation
That's
power.
the point
Yeah.
of generally of a buy-in concept. You see that in the crypto business as well, in the crypto world as well. Occasionally, you have to stake a certain amount to be considered a stakeholder of a particular network, and then you get rewarded with staking rewards. So similar idea, maybe.
Don't quite comprehend the deception of this system at first glance. Very few people do. It is purposely complex. The economist John Maynard Keynes once wrote, "By this means, government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft."
I'm really curious what Keynes said right before that in whatever he wrote, because this looks like it's pulled out of context to me.
It's a lot of out of context. Let me just answer here. To elaborate, if I know my currency is inflating, then it makes me act differently than it was. Sure, yeah, you're gonna panic buy when there's high inflation. We've seen this in Argentina, and even now, maybe not exactly the same example, but with the tariffs, the Trump tariffs, a lot of people front-loaded imports because they wanted to
To
get the
avoid the
import
tariff.
before the prices went up. So it ostensibly went up. We don't even know it yet. But I guess for the importers, yeah, the prices are going to go up if the tariffs remain. If the government decided to just create the money and directly spend it on the citizens, would that create a cash society? Since you no longer need to go to banks to create your money.
I'm not sure what you mean by cash society, but I
I
mean,
don't know either, but it's maybe just a society where people don't borrow. But the thing is, the point of the banking system is also to make good investments and identify risks and underwrite good loans in order to facilitate the capital development of the economy to where you build machinery, computers, products, inventions that don't immediately serve the consumer needs, but rather improve worker productivity in the long run, so you can ultimately pump out more goods. So that's kind of so if the banking system goes away, then somebody still has to do that task, or the economy, or you want to have a more pastoral, simple economy where you enjoy nature and cows and all that. Sure, maybe that's a possibility. Then you're not an industrial economy that comes with
well,
benefits
even
and
that, if we go back to the example I gave with the Panic of '73 or whatever it was, the
Mhm,
agricultural system has this need for the supply to expand and contract just due to the nature of agriculture.
mhm.
Right. And so to Nima's point, we're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater here saying, oh, the banks are bad and everything's bad and get rid of it, blah, the whole thing is that the banks are supposed to serve a purpose, which is to identify when the money supply should be expanded and when it should be contracted. And I wouldn't necessarily trust that operation fully to a government system.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
hopefully I make sense. Yeah, so even small inflation forces people out. That's what Charles is saying. Onto the risk of an attempt to preserve purchasing power. Small inflation forces people out into the risk curve. Maybe I'd have to see some research on that. The basic inflation that's actually covered by the savings interest you earn, or maybe even exceeded by the savings interest you earn, may not really concern people all that much. They become used to it and becomes factored into all the calculations and prices and wage demands in the economy. Post office used to be banks, Jesus. Yes. So this is an argument that is interesting. I think. Do we even need a competitive banking system, or could the whole banking system just be government run? There are benefits and detriments to each of those concepts. You kind of, if you want to have an innovative economy with lots of crazy innovations like AI and all that, then you tend to be in favor of a more competitive banking system. If you want to have a more planned economy, maybe you could do with. I mean, the banking system is essentially um, a public-private partnership. But it is a government system. It's part of the government system. The banks get a license from the government to lend money and all
Into
that stuff.
existence.
But
Yeah.
their profits are private, right? So there's some competitive element. So there's arguments for
Well, and
both.
then I think it's worth pointing out that Jesus here is actually now asking a should question.
Yeah.
Now that we recognize the system, should we do this or should we do that? Now we can have a real conversation
Hmm.
about a real solution. Maybe we should put it more toward the government. Maybe we should put it more toward the private banking system. But now we're actually addressing what's really happening. Versus if we listen to Mike Maloney here, we're just going to come up with solutions that don't address the reality of the situation at all. We're just like spinning our heads in circles, going, "Oh, we're trying to solve this. We're trying to solve that," for a system that doesn't even exist, right? And so by being able to have the conversation and be able to correctly say or correctly describe how the monetary system, how the financial system, how the economy works, we could then start having real conversations like Jesus, you still haven't corrected how to pronounce the name correctly. That he's bringing up is now we're actually having a real conversation on what we should or shouldn't do with the economy. And as Nima pointed out, that we could argue, hey, if we want more publicly driven investment, we could lean it more toward the government. If we want more privately driven investment, we could lean it more toward the private sector, and we could argue the pros and cons of both. Personally, I'm in favor of making sure that there is a private sector, a market component that does seek out that innovation.
Yeah, I agree.
Jesus, okay. All right, let's continue.
I believe that presented correctly, anyone can understand this system, regardless of how complex it is. So let's do a recap and break it down even more. The way the system works is that, step 1, the government creates glorified IOUs. These bonds increase our national debt and put the public on the hook to pay it back.
Incorrect.
Step 2, IOUs are swapped to create currency. The Treasury sells the bonds to the banks. The banks then turn around and sell our national debt at a profit to the Federal Reserve, which they probably own. The Federal Reserve then opens its checkbook that doesn't have a penny in it and buys those IOUs with IOUs that it writes.
Why at a profit? How do you know that? How do you know they sell them at a profit? It's possible that the bank...
They sell it at a loss.
Let's say the bank buys the bonds, interest rates go up. Now if they sell it to the Fed, it would be at a loss. Yeah.
And isn't that's what happened to Silicon Valley Bank, right?
Yeah. And what happened to First Republic as well.
Checking account that has a zero balance. Then they give those checks to the banks and currency just springs into existence. And then the whole process repeats. This results in a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury, which is really just a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the numbers in the various branches of the government, and we get to step 3. The government spends the numbers on promises, public works.
And again, this whole elaboration between step 1 and step 3, there's literally no good reason why we can't just go to step 1 to step 3 and just have the government print the money and forget this whole bond nonsense.
And how about discussing the corruption of Congress wasting our money? Like, why is that not the root cause to address? Why is this whole plumbing on the back end the thing that he's obsessed with? And then whatever Congress spends money, it's just an afterthought. That's where the problem lies, if anything. We've just even recently seen it with the Doge revelations, how much stupid shit they spend money on. That should be the focus. Everything else is a distraction that distracts you from the actual cause of the spending.
Right.
Social programs, and war. Then the government employees, contractors, and soldiers deposit their pay into the banks, and we get to step 4, where the banks multiply the numbers by magically inventing more IOUs through fractional reserve lending, where they steal a portion of everyone's deposit and lend it out.
Again, I think we put to bed that is just a completely inaccurate way of how the banking system works.
Right.
That
also, you notice how
gets
this description of the economy, there's no private sector. there's no business lending. There's no machinery. There's no factories, no production. It's like government workers and banks are the only agents in his system here.
Redeposited, and then a portion is stolen again. And the process repeats over and over, magnifying the currency supply exponentially. Then we work for some of those numbers, which brings us to step 5, where our numbers are taxed. We pay tax to the IRS, who then turns our numbers over to the Treasury so the Treasury can pay the principal plus the interest on bonds that were purchased by the Federal Reserve with a check from nothing. Then we get to step 6, the debt ceiling delusion. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt and will eventually collapse under its own weight because politicians always kick the can down the road. They don't want it to collapse on their watch. And finally, step 7. The secret owners take their cut.
Secret owners take
The world's
their cut,
largest
Nima.
banks own the Federal Reserve. Those banks make a profit selling.
No, they don't. Even small banks.
This process just keeps, like, his arrows. It's like the conspiracy theorist memes, the guy with the board and all the arrows.
Yeah. And then again, like I said that you had to be a national bank in order to be a stockholder of the Federal Reserve. As any local state bank, you can choose to be governed by the Federal Reserve. This is interesting about banks, is there's several options of rules that you could choose to be governed by. And as a small local state bank, you don't have to choose to be governed by the Federal Reserve, but you could, and if you did, you have to buy stock. So no, it's not the world's largest.
You could be a credit union too.
Yeah.
So we have Charles
Our
Kirk saying he
national
focuses
debt.
on the system instead of Congress because he thinks it's a moral hazard. Yeah, and I disagree with that. I guess.
Yeah,
I don't think.
and I mean,
I don't think
if
that
it's
maybe
true,
there's moral hazard in there, but that's not the source of the corruption in Congress. I don't believe. I think
I
it
agree.
starts with the Congress people and their the groups that court them, and we discussed this before. All these what are these institutions called? The Governors Association, this association, this infiltration of the federal bureaucracy, and the way in which they are motivated to pass one policy or another. That is, I think, far more at the root of their activities than this back-end plumbing of the monetary system.
To the Fed. They make a profit when the Fed pays them interest on the reserves held at the Fed, and the Fed pays them a 6% dividend on their ownership of the Fed.
Wait. That's not what he said earlier.
Own the Federal Reserve. Those banks make a profit selling our national debt to the Fed. They make a profit when the Fed pays them interest on the reserves held at the Fed.
Okay, that's right. So the first part, they make a profit when they sell the national debt to the Federal Reserve. Again, that's a maybe. Like we said, they could take a loss, and then they make an interest on the reserves held at the Fed. Again, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what's going on.
But also the interest. The entire public earns interest on the bonds, not just the banks. Everyone who owns bonds in their portfolio for their retirements, retirees, everyone has the ability to earn bonds, not just the banks.
Yep.
And the Fed pays them a 6% dividend on their ownership of the Fed. This system is fundamentally evil. It funnels wealth from the working population to the government and the banking sector. It is the cause of the artificial booms and busts of modern economies, and it causes great disparity of wealth between the rich and the working class. And it is only possible because we no longer use real money.
Here it comes, Nima.
We use currency. But worst of all, it is a form of enslavement. Bond is the root word of bondage. Whenever a government issues a bond, it is a promise to make us pay tax in the future. Nobody asked you if you wanted to pay tax today for the prosperity we all enjoyed in the last century. Nobody is asking our children if they want to work hard in the future to pay for the prosperity we're enjoying now. George Washington once wrote to James Madison, "No generation has the right to contract debts greater than can be paid off during the course of its own existence."
We all know that George Washington was a famous economist.
Yeah.
By stealing prosperity from tomorrow, so we can spend it today, we enslave ourselves and future generations. Now, this all sounds pretty bad, but there is great hope, for you are the greatest threat to this false monetary system. This system relies on the public being ignorant of its workings. Please share this knowledge with everyone you know, because an informed public that fully understands the system can build a better future for generations to come.
Yeah, how?
And now I leave you with this quote. widely attributed to a former director of the Bank of England. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again.
Again, that might be partially true as long as they have the backing of the government to make the regulations appropriately and to control the spending appropriately to do what they say.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get Silicon Valley or First Republics because you're not part of the secret cabal, I guess.
Yeah. There's political cabals in
Yeah.
this country. Yes, we agree. That is a problem.
But if you want to continue as the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and to control credit. This is the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. It's located on Constitution.
Also, I think it's worth pointing out that there's a categorical difference between a central bank and your bank down the street.
Yeah.
They're two completely different things. So just to be like, oh, the banks, we got to be kind of clear on what we're talking about.
Street. And that is just as much of a joke as the New York Fed being located on Liberty Street. Both of them are unconstitutional. Both of them limit our liberty. And they transfer wealth away from us every second of every day to the Federal Reserve, to the government, and to the banking sector. You are now among the 1 in a million who can detect the theft of your prosperity. So the big question is, what can you do about it?
My goal.
1. Watch this video until you can describe and teach it to others. Those who understand this system can make preparations for its unavoidable collapse and protect themselves. History shows that those who don't will probably be wiped out. 2. Share this video with everyone, especially those you care about. All it takes is a mouse click.
What was that, Nima?
I mean, this is like the third time he's telling me to share this video with others.
Click or two to get this message in front of millions. Post this video on Facebook, tweet it, email it to loved ones. Please share it wherever you can. 3. Join the conversation. The current world monetary system is based on a 300-year-old design meant to enrich a few at the expense of the many. There must be a better way. At hiddensecretsofmoney.com, we've created an open-source platform for the design and development of a new world monetary system. We're calling on every economist, every student, every college, every bright mind, and anyone who cares to join the discussion.
We should go there and start.
In educating ourselves and each other, we can prevent the further loss of our freedoms and maybe, just maybe, win some of them back.
Okay, is this the sales pitch at the end?
And there's going to be Ron Paul.
To a lot of people, and like I've just
Ron Paul
talk
stuff.
about today, I was a
Records.
monetary on any points. It was really like something out of a
The
PhD
gold.
course. Except
I'm not going to go through this.
Yeah, and
last
then there's
part.
Steve Forbes, and it's like, the gold bug, usual suspects.
Well, he did not advertise his own gold company, so
No,
I appreciate
at
it.
the very end, there's, I think at the very end there's something, but yeah.
Oh, there it is. Okay, I guess he did. And again, it goes back to, if the money's so worthless, or if the fiat fake IOUs are so worthless and the gold's so valuable, why are you selling it?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I am a fan of gold. I like gold. I invest in gold. I own a lot of gold. And we've talked about that on our show many times, how you can allocate some of your money into gold and have it help you become more wealthy and more financially independent. So not knocking gold or whatever, just like disagreeing with some of the conclusions conveyed here, or some of the errors in the understanding of the existing monetary system, which causes you to focus on minutiae rather than actually being productive in the discussion. Charles says here, basically he thinks if there was a balanced budget, then the government wouldn't have as much money to spend on corruption. Well, why wouldn't they? What if they tax us 70% and spend all that money, and there's a balanced budget? They would have tons and tons of money. Oh wow, you guys biggest fan,
Thanks,
deploying
Charles.
ideas. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, a balanced budget doesn't mean that there's no money for corruption in the government, right? It actually, it could be they raise a ton of money, they tax the crap out of us and spend that same amount on all their lavishness and all their nonsense.
Well, and then if they have power, they'll figure out some way to go to war. I mean,
For sure.
right? I mean, it's like we talked about before. Let's say there is a balanced constitutional budget. Well, if there's a big enough war that requires that we, throw every thing that we possibly can at the war, I'm pretty sure Congress will sit down and be like, yeah, we're canceling this balanced budget
But why is the balance?
constitutional amendment.
What
Yeah.
does it even matter? How does a balanced budget prevent corruption to begin with? Let's say they
Right.
keep a balanced budget. It could be a balanced budget because they tax the hell out of us, like a country like Germany, for example, or whatever. So there's no correlation between balanced budget and eliminating corruption or whatever. In fact, I would actually probably say it cripples the private sector even more. It gives the government even more power, and so makes more room for corruption, in my opinion.
So, in summary, thank you, Mike Maloney, for giving us the opportunity for having this breakdown. But again, this is a perpetuation of these. I mean, I don't even know what to call it at this point. It's like this: if you're in the broadest sense of the term, the freedom movement, you are supposed to accept on face value that this Austrian description, which is what Mike Maloney gave, of the monetary system of the Federal Reserve and the bonds and whatever, is true by definition, and that's part of the thing enslaving us. And we're trying to push back at that and say this is a story that actually, A, doesn't even make any sense on its face, but B, doesn't have any evidence to support it whatsoever. And yes, there are evil people doing evil things to us. Yes, there is a secret cabal of people that want to turn us all into slaves. However, if you're going to do something about that, you need an accurate description of reality in which you could put solutions. And one of the big secret cabal tools is to put us all into austerity, and the austerity happens primarily through pulling back the deficit. And so now all these Austrians have been convinced, yeah, we need the austerity. We got to pull back the deficit. We need the austerity. We got to pull back the deficit. Well, that's the boom bust cycle where they let everything grow, pull it back. Everything becomes a fire sale because the economy crashes. They could buy all this stuff up at pennies on the dollar and do it again, right? You're actually contributing to that cycle by perpetuating this myth.
For sure, yeah, that is.
And we want to stop that, or help, at least have a conversation about stopping the perpetuation of that myth.
Yep, agree.
Nima, do you have any final comments on?
Bro, I mean, we've like commented for 2 hours and 7 minutes now. I don't have any more.
You're spent. Okay. Excellent. Well, I appreciate everybody who watched. We had a pretty good audience today. We only had Charles and Jesus commenting, but great questions from both of you guys. Appreciate everybody watching. This will be there's a recording of this. It'll be up to view, and then our editing guy, I'm sure, will chop up little pieces of this so you don't have to sit through a full 2 hours of monetary excitement. But in the meantime, check us out at irita.tv. Follow us on X. Just search Irita TV. Follow us on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey. We got a Telegram channel. We got a Discord channel. You can find it all at irita.tv. This has been Dylan Moore and Nima Bajur, and we thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.